everyone, and welcome back. This week we're getting started on the second garment in the Muppets Christmas Carol Gonzo ensemble, the waistcoat. This is probably the most fun and flashy garment of the entire ensemble. I am in love with it. It is just blindingly great. And the best part is the original is pretty darn accurate. It's pretty good to go. I had to make a lot of decisions in terms of the design just because it is a much smaller version. It doesn't really show us all of those details. I don't know what the back looks like. I don't know what the pockets are like. All of those tiny details that I have to decide in its full-sized version, which meant a lot of research, and not just research into how to pattern it or design it, but how to sew it, how to figure out what type of fabric I should be going with for not only the front, but the interiors and the linings and all the different parts. There's just always a shocking number of decisions to be made in something as small and simple as a waistcoat. And not surprisingly, in all of that research I was doing and all of the decisions I was making, I always have a moment of pause as I'm figuring out the patterning and chalking everything out as to which side has the buttonholes and which side has the buttons. Most of the time with the garments that I buy, they tend to be out of the women's department, and quite frankly, they go both ways. I have a pretty even number of things that go left over right versus right over left. Menswear, however, is consistently left over right. And there is a lot written as to why this is, why menswear is this way or why women's wear is the opposite way. There's a lot of theory there. And of course, that gave me a question I didn't have an answer to. So guess what happened? Hours of research to figure that out. But before we dive into all of that research and get into all of the choices I had to make on this really crazy waistcoat, I'm going to take a moment to thank the sponsor for this week's video, HelloFresh. I know they say it's the most wonderful time of the year, but it's also the busiest time of the year. And in the middle of planning on holidays and work, I still need to remember to eat. So I rely on HelloFresh. That means a box of fresh ingredients and creative recipes shows up at my door every week, and I barely have to think about it. Even when I decide to make up an entire 1840s ensemble in a month, I can still manage a great dinner. Each week there's a wide variety of meal options available that I can match with my schedule and my tastes. If I know we'll be busy, I rely on their quick and easy options, some of which only take a few minutes to prepare and require absolutely no cleanup. Not only am I managing to eat healthy and fresh, but I'm learning more about cooking along the way. And there's no trip to the busy grocery store or forgotten ingredients sitting in the fridge. Each week is customized to what I need. I pick what day the box arrives, can easily add or remove a meal, and right now they have all sorts of seasonal extras like cheesecake bars, cookies, or even charcuterie boards. There are so many choices in the menu, and you can see the meals and adjust the schedule weeks in advance so you can set it and forget about it. So go to HelloFresh.com and use code NicoleR14 for up to 14 free meals and 3 free gifts. It really is the easiest way to balance great food and a busy life. Just go to HelloFresh.com and use code NicoleR14 for up to 14 free meals and 3 free gifts today. Thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this week's video. Now, diving into the concept of gendering your clothing closures in front. This, from what I can find in the Western European sort of subject area, tends to really pick up as a concern and a question in the 1880s. So I could find a lot of articles about it. I found one in the late 1870s, but nothing prior to that point. So it wasn't really something that they were discussing as a concern. In other cultures around the world, there are different decisions made. Left over right is common in many different areas, such as in China with the hanfu or in Japan with the kimono. But again, it is not gendered. It is everyone closes left over right. Other areas and other groups will choose right over left. If you look at modern day Hasidic Jews, they will also very often choose right over left. This is something that they specifically culturally are choosing to do. So there are going to be differences all around the world, but in terms of the modern day mass manufactured fashion that we all have to deal with, it is pretty consistently men's is left over right and women's is right over left, or a mix thereof. And this seems to be based off of some older European concepts. Now, figuring out where this started is really muddy and really complicated when it comes to the left over the right being a standard option. When we go pretty far back and we start looking at when buttons really start coming in, 10th, 11th century, most of the imagery that you're going to see is going to be left over right. It is a little bit inconsistent, and it's kind of hard to judge because there's not a lot of imagery. There are very few surviving things. There's not documentation on this. A lot of the art that we see throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern era is print. So meaning that, did they do this correctly the first time and then it got flipped when it was printed? It's hard to tell. So I tried to stick to looking at things like originals and portraiture, stuff that's not likely to have been invented out of the mind, stuff that is likely to have been done looking at something and is what it is, or is the original garment. And left over right is more common, which makes some sense, at least to me personally, from the aspect of dealing with ball buttons and loops or buttonholes right up against the edge. It seems a little easier for me as somebody who is fairly ambidextrous and can do buttons both ways, no problem. I do find it easier with ball buttons and the closures of those earlier times to be doing it that way. The reason why I'm going to base my theory off of this rather than some of the other theories that you see is the fact that this is a relatively universal concept. The other theories that I have seen as to why menswear fastens that way tend to be all based on the idea that men are fighters and they go into battle and they constantly have swords and wars and all sorts of things like that. It's very much men are strong based. And this is the idea that they have a sword with them all the time. And so they need to be able to reach through that opening in their coat and grab their sword at any given time, which would be a possibility if it weren't for the fact that the vast majority of the early eras where we're used to seeing some men, and I'd emphasize some as a small group of men carrying swords all the time, they are wearing fitted buttoned garments. So doublets and jerkins are fitted closely to the body and the sword goes over it. So you don't need to reach through a garment into a large skirted garment until really the later 17th century, and the buttons on one side or the other has been well established by that point, so this is nothing new. Definitely not that started it. I have also seen more modern theories that it has something to do with the armor plating being left over right, because as you would put your shield on your left arm, you would face your left side towards your opponent, and you didn't want the sword blade to be able to enter into the armor, so it would be plated left over right. I don't know a ton about armor, but what I do know from seeing, I don't even know how many sets of armor in museums at this point in my life, there's a lot of different styles of armor. They vary widely based off of time periods and very tiny regions. There is not one set type of doing armor. On top of this, armor is not made by tailors. The stuff that went under the armor kind of helped develop the tailoring trade, theoretically. That's the history that I've learned, at least. And so there might be some relationship there, but again, this is one type of armor that they're talking about and one type of fighting, and there are definitely different types all over Europe and in different time periods. So one specific type of armor changing the entirety of how we do clothing is a lot to take in. It's taking a very niche time period, location, style, class, all of those things, and applying it to a very large population, which is a big step. So ignoring that those are pretty unlikely and that we're not holding over wrapped clothing from earlier eras wrapping a certain way. I've heard that too, which, yeah, left draped over the arm and fastened on the right side was definitely a thing because you usually had your right arm free so you could function with it, but when you look at the way that fashion moves, it was hundreds of years from the wrapping eras to the buttons being more common, and there's a lot of straight, unfitted garments that are belted in or laced up on the sides. Between those two and the memory capacity of humans to remember hundreds of years later how we did things that aren't even the same things. We're not talking about the same garment coming back in. It's a completely different concept of garment. It's a big leap, like, to think that we remembered that in our cultural mindset. So likely it's more just a fact of this was easier for people with right hands. That makes sense. So if it's true that it's easier for people with right hand dominance, why did women's wear develop the other way? So let's start by looking at when that actually happened, because that will answer a lot of questions really, really fast, because the theories as to why this is true are just, there's a lot. So when you look at women's wear of just about anything up through the 18th century, it is dominantly left over right. It's because tailors are making that clothing, they're making the buttoned clothing in the 18th century, even when mantua or gown makers come in. They are taking care of a different type of women's garments, ones that don't generally have buttons. So riding habits and other things that are similar to men's suits are still being made by tailors. Again, they're keeping consistent with the left over right. There are examples the opposite way, but they're pretty consistently more so left over right. So obviously this isn't a worry when it comes to the 18th century as to a gender issue. And when it comes to women's everyday garments, the things that are gowns that lap over in the front and use straight pins to close, you see both ways pretty consistently. I prefer mine left over right because of the way that I learned to put pins in, but I have also seen descriptions about it being right over left preferred for some because of the way that they put pins in. So this seems to be a matter of how you were taught and your personal preference, not a gender issue. Again, when we move into the early 19th century, there are still plenty of buttoned garments for women, but very often women's day garments start fastening in the back, or the front closures are a bib closure, so we're no longer dealing with a center front opening. And it's not really until we get more towards the 1840s and 50s that center front closing comes back in. And at this point, while pins are still an option, it is much more commonly found to fasten your clothing with hooks and eyes. And again, this is where a little bit of personal experience comes in. Though I am fairly ambidextrous, as I said, I cannot do hooks and eyes the opposite way. I have to do right over left. I have to put hooks on my right side and eyes on the left and fastened that way. This is, again, my personal experience with that, but when you look at women's garments of that era, originals, they do tend to most often be right over left for hooks and eyes. So that is a very distinct choice that is made because of the type of closure. And it's a type of closure that wasn't common before that, and it's a type of closure that stops being common fairly quickly because we move from hooks and eyes into buttons and buttonholes. And there are fake buttons on a lot of things, say in the 1860s. And then as we move into the 1870s, more and more examples that use actual buttons and buttonholes, and then it seems to just stick with the right over left. They were already making the gowns to do that. They already had gotten used to the idea of having the extension under that left side, so they just, as dressmakers, continued to do that. And women learned how to do their buttons that way. Now, I know this is a seemingly pretty boring answer, and that all of those myths and theories are way more exciting. There are such things as women had to have their clothing fastened the opposite way because they carry babies. This was pretty quickly debunked because he was claiming you carry babies in your dominant hand, and then you have your other hand to fasten all the buttons, so you need to be able to do it with your left hand. But if you've ever really spent a lot of time carrying around a baby, you put it in your non-dominant arm, so you have your other one free to actually do some stuff. So that was very quickly debunked in the same article. Same thing goes for the idea that right hand is preferable over left hand, and that left hand is a sign of being weaker or less developed, and so women are doing things with their left hand only because they are weaker and less developed than men. Which the same thing happened. The article immediately debunks by the fact that if you watch women do this, they use both hands, just like men do. And it doesn't matter which side it's on, they just reverse that. So even if that was true, it doesn't make a difference when coming to fastening buttons. Which is not true, by the way, but it was one of the theories they had come up with at the time. So either way, that got debunked really fast. The ones that I have seen that have held on longer are that women had maids to dress them. And that's why it was reversed, because the maids were the one doing the fastening. And this is pretty quick to debunk in the fact that if women had enough maids, enough servants in the household that they could devote a good portion of the maid's time to helping them get dressed in garments that they themselves can easily get dressed in. We're not talking about helping with lacing up a corset. We're not talking about getting into a backlacing ball gown. We're talking about buttoning buttons up in front of yourself. If you are so wealthy that you have enough people with enough time to do that for you, you probably also have valets to help the men get dressed. So at this point, that might become a class thing rather than a gender thing. So if we saw that all upper class clothing fastened at the back or fastened right over left because servants always dressed them and they never touched their own clothing, then sure, maybe, but it's not a gender sensible thing because both men and women were dressed by servants and the vast majority of the population was not. So why would you need to develop that? And why suddenly have it come into existence in the 1850s, where apparently no one ever had anyone dress them prior to that point. So all the women in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries with their buttoned garments never had anyone helping them get dressed. So that's off the table. And then the last theory that I've regularly heard, which I myself thought was pretty reasonable for a good long while, and now think better of it, is the idea that it was used to separate out men's and women's wear on purpose in the late 19th century as they started to look more similar, when we're getting white shirts being commonly worn by both, essentially. And well, I can see something there, obviously. The fact is, this is from a very modern perspective, that their shirts look similar to us in modern day, whereas the more time I spend in that era, the less those shirts look alike. The more it is obvious by simply the way that the sleeves are gathered into the cuffs, the size of the cuffs, the size of the collar, the way that the front is gathered up or done up is a lot more obvious than stopping, looking down at those buttons and thinking about it for a hot second, remembering, wait, which is which for who? It's not faster for me to judge a shirt by right over left versus left over right as it would be for me to simply look and go, oh, look at those puffy little sleeve heads, it's a women's blouse. So there are definitely differentiations between the two, but they are stylistic. They don't have to be right versus left. So that, again, gets knocked out because it is not the fastest and easy way to differentiate, and the differentiation really, like I said, picked up in that 1840s, 50s period, even with the fake buttons that were there, and this was long before women's garments started to hold any resemblance to men's garments. Women's gowns definitely couldn't be mixed up with men's suits, so that's not important for them to develop at that point in time. But as that develops, by the time we reach the 1880s, they've been doing it for a good 20, 30 years consistently, maybe even longer, and it's a whole generation that they've now forgotten why they started doing that in the first place. Not that there weren't people that theorized in the late 19th century with the same concept that I had, that it developed out of the fact that hooks and eyes and pins and things like that were used, and so that's why women's garments developed that way. There definitely were examples of that, so some people used that, but gradually those examples sort of faded out over the more interesting and exciting options that we had for saying why men and women are so very different fundamentally, and men's and women's things have to just be so terribly different. So it makes more sense when you think of it from a 19th century perspective of trying to intentionally gender everything. That's really why we have the difference, more so than anything else. Practical reasons that turned into established concepts. So this is one of many things that I was thinking about when working on this seemingly simple waistcoat. The entire thing, though, started with the fact that I had to figure out the fabric. Now, as I talked about in a previous video, plaids were definitely a big thing. There were all sorts of different options, and I definitely did find options of larger checks, like the one on Gonzo's original waistcoat, so that is an accurate style. That particular sort of tartan did exist in the 19th century, and those colors, sort of a bright orange and red, did exist as well as dye options. So the best bet for me was to actually see if I could find something like the original. Most of the waistcoats that I found for this era when it came to tartan plaids tended to be out of a velvet. This is usually a silk or sometimes a wool velvet. This is not something that I can easily find. So I'm not going to try to find a very specific color of plaid. I can barely find it in solids. It is not worth the time or the money for me to try and do that. I could also have gone with a wool option. Again, I wasn't finding anything that was the right color or the right particular plaid, so that wasn't working out terribly well. Woven silks are definitely an option, but most commonly today, I'm going to be able to find options in a silk taffeta, which is what I did find. There was a great example that I found from Prism Silks, which was the right colors, the right sort of particular tartan plaid, and hopefully, theoretically, the right proportions. I just went ahead and got it, hoping it wasn't going to come in a home decor size tartan. But thankfully it came in, it was the right size, and so I'm going forward with that. Taffeta definitely was something that they used. I found taffeta plaid examples, so it is historically accurate, and it's something that I can be practical with. As for the rest of the decisions, those kind of got made as we went. I did know that I was going to be specifically using this drafting manual, because this is the one that I could find that was around late 1830s, early 1840s, that had a good number of plates with lots of different styles in them, and was pretty clear in its instructions. I don't recommend this to a beginner when it comes to drafting. It missed a lot. It doesn't give me a specific shawl collar style, which is what the version that you see on Gonzo is. It's a double-breasted shawl collar, meaning that you don't see the points for the collar, and it's not a separate collar around the neck necessarily. It's just one solid collar the whole way down. So I'm going with that version for the pattern adjustments, as you will see, and the rest of those tiny little decisions as to what fabric I'm using where, how I'm piecing things together, how I'm doing the facing, how I'm doing the interfacing, how I'm doing the pocket welting. We'll talk about all of that as I get into the sewing portion. The first decision to be made was how I was going to deal with the shawl collar. Now this can be one piece that is entirely attached to the front, it can be a separate seamed on piece if you need a lot of curve around the neckline, or it can have a third option of a seam which treats it sort of like a collar as you would think of for a typical jacket. That's the method that I ended up choosing for my final format, just because it allowed me to bring the collar in a little bit closer around the neck area than the completely grown on style would, and it didn't need the entire curve of a separate piece. So you can see there the odd shape that you end up with for the final pattern shape, where it's just got that sort of curved out neckline chunk that will be filled in by a separate collar. Of course, doing this in a really obvious large check meant that I was going to have to make sure to cut everything out single layer and match it up perfectly. As for the linings, I went with 2 different colors of glazed cotton because that seemed to be a pretty typical thing, as we will get into. The pockets are just 2 small welt pockets at the base of the waistcoat. The upper pocket, the breast pocket, isn't really that common just yet. It seems to be coming into style, but isn't nearly as common as doing just the 2 pocket openings at the bottom. There were also questions that I had about the shape of this. A lot of the originals that I looked at were not a just standard rectangular welt like I'm used to for more modern styles, but instead they actually had an angle at each end, sort of a little trapezoid boat shape, if you will. And this is the shape that I decided to go with because it seemed really typical for 1840s waistcoats that I was looking at. And I like the fact that it's a little bit different than what I've done before. The technique, though, is really similar to how I've done welted pockets for lots of different time periods. So there are definitely a variety of ways you can do welted pockets, but this is my favorite method, and it doesn't really depend on a specific era. I'm just making sure that everything is lined up perfectly with that check pattern and that the interfacing is caught up by the different stitches. And then I can get into actually deciding what I want this to look like, because originally I was just going to do a plain welted pocket, and it didn't look that exciting. So I went back and looked at originals and found that sometimes they had a little bit of cording or braid that went around the edges of the welting, and sometimes around the entire garment as well. I chose to just do it around the welted pocket portion. I felt like it might be too much to do around the entire garment, but it helped that little section of the welted pocket to pop out. I had a fairly wide braid that was the right color, but not the right size. I folded it in half, and just a very small portion of it is sticking out beyond the edge of the welt. In order to attach this braid, just like would have been done with the narrow braid at the edge, I'm doing a stitch that goes through all of the layers back and forth. It's similar to what we have now modern day termed a mantua maker stitch, but it shows up as just a little felling stitch on both sides. It just means that I'm not having to fell the exterior to the tape and then fell the lining to the tape as well. So I'm just doing it all in one single stitch pattern, which does mean that it is a prick stitch of sorts rather than being able to continuously work the needle through. Moving on then to adding the pocketing, this is just the same glazed cotton that I have for the back of the waistcoat and a few other spots, and it just needs to be a strong cotton that is going to deal with decent wear and tear since it's a pocket. It's a really shallow pocket, so it's not going to get a lot of use. I'm not sure what I could actually even fit in there, but despite that, it still needs to be really well reinforced. So I'm felling over the top edge, which I used the really nice selvage of the cotton for, and I'm also going through and doing a spaced back stitch or prick stitch just below where the seam is. This is another element that I found really common on originals, and so I definitely wanted to mimic that on this, which is not something I've done for later era waistcoats before. So excited to try something a little bit different in this process of making a welted pocket. After I am nearly completed with the pocket, I haven't stitched down the welt on the ends just yet. I'm going to go ahead and add in my interfacing canvas layer. I'm choosing to do this ahead of time because it will allow me to anchor the pocketing to this layer. If I choose to do a canvas inner lining that does not cover the entire body, that stops short of the side seam, which is a pretty common way of doing it, then I would actually add a little strip of canvas that tacks to that pocket welt when I stitch it down and sort of extends like a little arm out to the side seam. I specifically chose to go with a full body canvas because I have such a lightweight material. This taffeta is not really heavy, and I felt like it could use a little bit more body and a little bit more strength in order to give it that substance that I felt that it needed. If I was using a heavier fabric, I definitely wouldn't want to extend the canvas out into that side seam and bulk up the side seam unless I absolutely had to. So I chose to do full body, but cutting it off a little bit, just a few inches before that side seam, is also really typical. You just need to reinforce the pocket if you choose to do that. From there, I'm able to start finishing off all of the edges and get that collar attached. This is very similar in many ways to a coat collar, but because it is attached the whole way down rather than sort of separating, I chose to go ahead and seam it up before I put the canvas in. I'm also not doing any pad stitching with this. I didn't find it to be necessary since this is going to be flat folded and pressed into place. It's not going to need a gentle roll over the collar. So instead of dealing with the time-consuming pad stitching, I'm just making sure that the canvas is stitched down around all the edges and not going to move around. And not doing the pad stitching, I feel like, was the correct choice. Having now been able to put on the final version, it folds really nicely and crisply along those edges, so I definitely didn't need to do the pad stitching. I'm also putting a little bit of reinforcement where the buttons are going to attach. I hadn't decided at this point which type of button I was going to use, but having that little bit of reinforcement there is great no matter what, just to hold the weight of the button and make sure that it doesn't stress the fabric too much. I can then start attaching the two fronts to each other at the back of the neckline, where I'm putting in a center seam. I chose to do a center back seam for the collar, which is not something you always see because I needed to match up that plaid. It needed to be equal on both sides. And generally you do cut the collar on an angle. That's pretty typical. It's going to be on the bias, and doing so with a large check like that, it really needs to be able to mirror image itself. The front facing is out of the same fabric, and I tried the best that I could to match up where these stripes of the plaid meet. Obviously, once I get up to where the collar starts to change shape, it does move off a little bit, but I matched it up the best I could so it would feel continuous as it folded back. The edges are all folded back and sandwiched together, and then they're finished with a spaced back stitch that looks the same on both sides. That is the final goal of this, and I found that documented in all of those tailoring manuals to make sure that you had a clean look on both sides. The other facing piece that I have to add in is out of that glazed cotton in the darker color. That is down at the bottom. I did find some later examples that had a leather strip there, which is really interesting, but I chose to go with that tan color of polished cotton down at the bottom to match the back, which will be visible. The actual lining portion, however, will be out of a different color. But first I need to make sure that I have all of the facings stitched down so they aren't going to move around. I'd rather do this by catch stitching the facings to the linen canvas, and then I only have to go through just the lining layers in order to tack it down. This is a great way to really keep everything in place but not have to do really deep stitches that could risk showing on the exterior. And as you can see here, the lining portion is actually out of an ivory colored glazed cotton. This seemed to be really common on almost all the examples I could find, no matter what the exterior color of the waistcoat was. That the front portion of the lining, as well as the lining in the back, was out of a very light colored cotton or linen. And I think this is because then you don't have to worry about it bleeding onto your shirt if you sweat. The back, before I start to attach it, needs a couple of straps. This allows me to tighten it up around the waist and make sure that it fits me really closely in that back. These backs don't seem to have a center back seam or any sort of shaping, so it's this strap that allows me to have that shaping. I'm doing this by way of a buckle and back, but there are plenty of examples that actually have little lacing panels instead that are usually 3 to 5 holes each. Once that is all attached, I can then start putting the backs to the fronts. Before I get started on stitching that portion, I have to do one really somewhat unusual thing. I actually have to cut a slit into the lower portion of the back. This is something I expected to see with a center back seam, but the originals don't seem to have that. The slit is there to allow me to cinch up and expand around the hips as needed. Then I can move on to the final steps of dealing with the buttonholes and buttons. This is a double-breasted waistcoat, but it will only have the buttonholes on the one side. I don't need to worry about putting buttonholes on the underside portion. I might choose to put buttons on the interior to hold into place, but I didn't find any originals that had that for this era, so I chose not to do that. I will, however, choose to put eyelets in for my buttons because they have a large metal shank. If I just simply stitched them to the exterior, they would sort of hang down and dangle. So instead of doing that, I want to push them through an eyelet and reinforce them on the back. You can do this by putting a piece of, say, linen tape through all of them, or little pins or little rings, things that hold it into place. In my case, I'm choosing to go with a strip of leather. I like using this because it's easy to pull back out and remove if I need to pop the buttons off for any number of reasons. This isn't a washable waistcoat, but in the case of ones that are meant to be washed, this is really typical for buttons, and having that leather strip on the back makes it really easy for me to remove it and not have to undo any stitching. But the rings or pins are also really great for that.